Right, guys, well, welcome back to episode 9 of the League Express podcast. My name's Jake KEARNAN, and joining me as always is the editor of League Express, MARTYN SADLER. MARTYN, how's it going?
Fine, Jake. Episode 9, my goodness. Where have all those episodes gone? Yeah, it's good to be here again, of course, and, it's been an interesting time, hasn't it? You know, a lot of important issues being settled in rugby league on both sides of the world, but a lot of interesting issues still to be settled. So a lot to look back on and a lot to look forward to, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of content in this week's edition of the League Express newspaper. Just a reminder for our viewers and listeners, if you do want to grab yourself a subscription, head to www.totalrl.com/shop. And I guess,
you'll have a great time if you do. You know, you'll read some great stuff. I'm fairly sure.
Exactly right. And this paper will be going mostly through the off season as well.
Mostly, yeah.
So
I think we take a week off at Christmas and New Year.
Yep.
But that's the only time.
No, perfect, because obviously there's always off-season news and player signings and the like. So
don't forget you can read it digitally as well, Jake. It's it goes up on Sunday night at about 9 o'clock. So if people want to download it onto their iPhone, tablet, or whatever, then you can do it, and it's you get to read it before you go to bed on Sunday night, which a lot of people quite like to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Get the jump on everyone who buys it in the shop,
absolutely.
That's for sure. And I think with that one, it'll just redirect you to the Pocket Mags website, which is quite an easy website to navigate. I've gotten a few copies on there. So, make sure you jump on, and if you are a more of a digital reader, you can get it early and, enjoy it on your Sunday night. But tell you what a weekend of football we've had, MARTYN. There was a few big score lines. Unfortunately, we have the news that Wakefield Trinity will be relegated. And it was a tough-fought battle for them against the Lee Leopards. They went down by 1 point.
Yeah, my club as a young boy, I used to support Wakefield religiously every week, and I'm a lot more neutral now, but I still obviously have a soft spot for Wakefield, and it's so sad to see them going down after 24 years in the top flight. And what a sad way to go, losing by a field goal in the golden point time at Lee. It could hardly be more heartrending, really. And the Wakefield players spread eagled on the pitch after the game. Gareth O'Brien, incidentally, the guy who kicks field goals that send teams down. In 2016, he famously sent Hull Kingston Rovers down with a field goal for Salford at Craven Park in their £1 million game, and he's done it again. He's an absolute expert at doing it, and good for him, but terribly sad for Wakefield. And what we don't know yet is what the financial impact will be on the Wakefield club, because whether they will get a parachute payment and how much it will be is to be decided in the near future, I think. And in the past, we found that relegation from Super League has had incredibly serious effects on clubs, because you've got to adapt to falling from a competition which is full-time to a competition which is part-time, and it normally means that a lot of players have to be released and new players engaged on part-time contracts. So it's a hell of a thing for Wakefield to have to do, but the extent to which they'll have to do it depends partly, at least, on whether they get a reasonable parachute payment for being relegated.
Yeah, okay. And I think I was reading an article by The Guardian this week, and they were talking about how well the London Broncos have been going in the Championship over the past couple of weeks, and then the difficulties they faced when they were relegated a few years back. Do you have any information? I understand it was they didn't get a very big parachute payment because that was in the midst of COVID.
Yes, no, I don't think they did, and it was disastrous. I mean, they were relegated on the last day of the season as well in 2019. Ironically, when they played at Wakefield, it was either Wakefield or London Broncos who were going to be relegated, depending on who lost that game, and it was them who lost it. And the other ironic thing about it was that Danny Ward was the London Broncos coach, and now, of course, he's the Castleford coach, and they've escaped relegation. So, things turn in circles, don't they? fortunately or unfortunately, as the case may be.
Yeah, absolutely right. So disappointing for Wakefield. We will touch on in the news a little bit more, but we'll move on. So we also had St Helens 18 defeated Warrington 6 on Friday night. Quite a tough-fought battle for Warrington, but Saints were just too good in the end.
Well, a massive improvement from Warrington at just the right time, actually, because we're just, coming to the playoffs, and Warrington are still there in 6th place, but they were without George Williams, and they played a young man called Leon Hayes at standoff half, a teenager who was playing his first game of the season, not his debut, because he's played a couple of games for them last year. But I thought he didn't let the side down at all, and Saints really had to work hard to win that game, and Warrington were a little bit unlucky, I thought, particularly when they had a try disallowed, but. It's Saints are firing, as they always do at this time of the year. Warrington are still battling with Salford for that 6th place. They'll be both playing on Friday night, of course. Salford will play at home to Catalans, and Warrington will visit Huddersfield, which is a game that they, could and should win, perhaps. But Huddersfield came back to form, didn't they, with scoring 50-odd points against Hull FC at the weekend, so that could be an interesting game too.
Yeah, for sure, and it's nice to see a little bit of excitement entering that final round of the season. I think we'll all be on the edge of our seats.
All the games being played, kicking off simultaneously on Friday night at 8 o'clock. Yes, so we'll see how it goes.
To get a few dual monitors set up, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah.
Watch a few of them. I guess moving on, we had Catalan's huge win, 61-0 over Leeds.
That's the biggest defeat margin that Leeds have suffered in the Super League era. It actually beats... In 2017, they were beaten 66-10 at Castleford. That was a 56-point margin, but and oddly enough, that year they went on to win the competition. So, there was something very odd about that year, but and they beat Castleford in the grand final. This year, of course, Leeds are not going to be in the playoffs, so they've got no chance of winning anything. And you wonder what on earth has happened to them. It was a disastrous performance all round. Incidentally, Adam Kieran for the Catalans scored 30 points, and that's a new record for that club. It beats Thomas Bosk's 26 points that he scored a few years ago. So that's a notable record for Adam Kieran, who will play for Wigan next year. So, the Catalans are clearly going strong, and at the moment it looks like a 3 or perhaps even 4 horse race for the grand final. Wigan, Saints, Catalans, and perhaps Lee. Obviously, Hull KR and whoever finishes 6th will have something to say about that. But it's looking like a really interesting build-up, isn't it? To once we reach the playoffs next weekend.
Yeah, I think they needed that win as well, because there's a few games there, a few uncharacteristic games, and I think that 61-point.
Yeah, well, they're in second place, so if they win at Salford next Friday or this coming Friday. Then they probably will finish second, because I think their points difference is substantially better than St Helens. It's 291 as opposed to St Helens in 3rd place, 229. So, St Helens, their final game is against Hull, and they may well run up a cricket score, but it's difficult to imagine that it would be sufficient to overtake the Catalans if the Catalans beat Salford. So, it's going to be very interesting. That Salford-Catalans game is a real crucial game for both sides.
Definitely. And one of the other teams you just touched on, Hull KR, 12, they defeated Salford 12-0. What did you make of this performance? Unlucky for Salford. Obviously, they're still tied on points with Warrington in that 6th spot.
Great defensive game for Hull KR. To put your opponents to nil, especially at this time of the year, is a great result for them. And the great thing for Hull KR is that they've got virtually a full squad turning out. Willie Peters is in the fortunate position of having a really fine squad to select from, and I'm sure that they really do fancy their chances of doing well, and it would be great for them to reach the grand final. They've got Sean Kenny Dowell, who's retiring at the end of the year, their captain, and he is. I think he's become a Hull KR icon since he's come here, and he's staying with the club on the coaching team next year. But they play at Wakefield, and I would think that they must be quite relieved that Wakefield did lose that game at the weekend, and don't now have a chance of staying up, because that might make Wakefield relax a bit. And obviously you'd expect Hull KR to win that game now that Wakefield are no longer battling to avoid relegation.
Exactly right. Moving on, we had the Giants 52 defeated Hull FC 20. A good return to form for Huddersfield, as you mentioned before.
Oh yes, and but really that simply shows what should have happened earlier in the season. Kevin Nagama scoring a hat-trick for Huddersfield, incidentally. I mean, Hull FC, there's something really soft at the heart of their culture. They fade away at the end of the season so frequently. They just don't seem able. There's an element of toughness that's lacking at Hull FC, and their supporters deserve better, in my view, Jake. And to see Hull, down in 10th place in Super League, that's not a place where a club with its level of support and enthusiasm ought to be sitting. And at some point, I mean, Tony Smith's got a really big rebuilding job next year, but he's got to instill, some degree of toughness into that side. I'm not quite sure how he's going to do it, who he's going to recruit, but it can't really carry on as it's been for the last few years. They ought to be one of the 2 or 3 biggest clubs in the league. They've got great support, a great stadium they play in. They've got enormous potential for support, but they're not fulfilling it at the moment. And at the moment, they're being outranked by their near neighbours, Hull KR, and which is great for Hull KR, of course. But we ought to see both Hull clubs in the playoffs, not just one of them.
Absolutely right. And we also had Wigan defeat Castleford Tigers 48-6. Again, another strong showing from Wigan as the playoffs approach.
Abbas Miski scoring 5 tries and going to joint top of the try-scoring chart. I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? He's had an absolutely incredible second half of the season, when in the first half of the season he wasn't being selected. He was actually, on loan at 1 or 2 other clubs. And what a incredible try-scoring guy he is. Absolutely marvellous. And Wigan, I just think, I mean, if I had to put some money on it at the moment, I would make Wigan the strong favourites to win the grand final this year. And Matty Pete, new 4-year contract, in his back pocket. Wigan are a smart club. They know that they've got to keep Matty on board. He's done such a great job in 2 seasons at the club, and I think Wigan, and they've already recruited so many good players for next year, including Adam Kieran from Catalans, who we mentioned earlier. So I think Wigan are really back to, very nearly back to the status of being the number 1 club in the game. St Helens will contest that very fiercely with them, of course. But it's great to see those 2 clubs doing so well.
Now, they've had some big score lines over the past couple of weeks, but how crucial do you think a tough match-up against the Lee Leopards this weekend will be?
Oh, I think it's great, and it's going to be on TV, isn't it? So, and Lee, I mean, I still think Lee are the story this year, coming up to Super League and doing so well, winning the Challenge Cup and getting into the top 6 and maybe even the top 4, depending on their result and Hull KR's result. It's looking very much like a Lee Hull KR game in the playoffs, in the opening weekend of the playoffs, isn't it? 4v5, whichever one of them finishes on top of the other. And I mean, they have built up a real rivalry this season, of course, with the Challenge Cup final having gone in Lee's favour. So I mean, what a game to look forward to that would be if it's repeated in the playoffs.
Oh, absolutely right. We also had some pretty exciting games go down in the Southern Hemisphere over the weekend. A couple of semi-finals. In the first one, we had Melbourne Storm 18 defeated Roosters 13. This one was a pretty close game that came down to the wire, but a late sort of try by Melbourne there.
I tell you what a great signing Will Warbrick's been for them, hasn't he? He played rugby union sevens, I think, for New Zealand. And I'm not quite sure how they recruited him, but I've watched a lot of him this year, and he's a really fine winger. And to score that try right at the end, collecting a bomb, and beating the defenders, the Roosters defenders, to catch it and touch it down was a real great piece of play. And I mean, I would imagine that he would now have a very good chance of walking into the Kiwis team, although of course they've also got Dallin Watini-Zelezniak, who's playing great for the Warriors. Yeah, so what a New Zealand are certainly the coming international team, aren't they?
Absolutely right. And I just had a feeling when Sam Walker, I believe it was Sam Walker, kicked that field goal around the 72, 71 minute mark. I just thought they'd left a little bit too much time left on the clock. You can never count Melbourne out. And obviously they got down in good field possession and capitalised with a try to Will Warbrick. And
now they play Penrith. Yeah, it's that's going to be a tough game for them. I think Penrith are really looking formidable, aren't they? Again, this season, and hard to see anybody beating them, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have had a little bit of news over the past few hours that Jerome Luai for the Panthers, he has been named in their side. Obviously, he's missed the last few weeks with a shoulder injury, and Jerome Hughes will be returning for the Storm, so it'll be return of the Jeromes.
Yes, that's going to be it's going to be a really interesting game to see, isn't it? It's being played, I think, on Friday at Accor Stadium, or also known as the Olympic Stadium in Sydney. It'd be interesting to see how many people they get coming to that game, won't it? Because, of course, Penrith can't host it at their own home ground.
That's right. The other matchup, we had New Zealand with a pretty rampant victory over the Newcastle Knights, 40 points to 10, in front of a packed New Zealand home crowd.
Well, the whole of New Zealand are getting behind the Warriors, aren't they? It's that, and they've created this incredible expression up the wires, haven't they? Which everybody in New Zealand seems to be coming out with, and what a game they face at Brisbane. And if they could beat Brisbane and get into the grand final, you'd get an enormous audience in New Zealand watching it. And I mean, there are lots of people saying that the New Zealand people are probably more interested in how the Warriors are doing than how the All Blacks are doing in the Rugby World Cup, which is quite a sensational. I don't know how true it is, but it would be nice to think it was somewhere near to being true, wouldn't it? And it's a great compliment to what Andrew Webster has done as a first season coach at the Warriors. I mean, he must surely be the Dally M Coach of the Year.
I really appreciated that scene of Sean Johnson getting an early mark. He sort of walked off the field and did the sort of long lap around the edge of the sideline and got to sort of farewell the crowd, and just hearing them cheer for him as he was taken off the field
brilliant,
was pretty
amazing. Wasn't it? Yeah, brilliant.
It was really touching. But that matchup on Saturday, Broncos versus Warriors, what I will say from someone who's experienced being in the crowd when the Warriors have played, Warriors have a lot of fans in Brisbane. There's a lot of New Zealanders who have moved over, who have located themselves in Brisbane. So I expect this home crowd advantage to be not 50-50, but there's going to be a lot of Warriors fans in the crowd, and it'll be quite a
they'll get lots of support. The interesting thing is how Reece Walsh will play, isn't it? Because he came from the Warriors at the start of the season, and he's been absolutely outstanding this year. And I think one of the biggest problems for the Warriors, apart from holding the mighty Brisbane pack, and in particular Payne Haas, but how to deal with Reece Walsh as an attacking threat is going to be quite crucial for them if they're going to win it. And it's certainly a game to look forward to on Saturday.
Absolutely. And just a little backstory on the history of these two clubs, on Reece Walsh, for our viewers and listeners. So I think there used to be a scout or Peter O'Sullivan. He was sort of like in charge of recruitment for the Warriors. I think he was pretty integral in bringing Reece Walsh from the Broncos to the Warriors. Now, during Reece Walsh's time at New Zealand, he then got the recruitment job with the Dolphins. So he moved across to the Dolphins. And there was a little bit of controversy when Reece Walsh signed with the Broncos that New Zealand wouldn't let him sign with the Dolphins because Peter O'Sullivan had left them to join the Dolphins and said, if you're going to return home to Brisbane, it can only be to the Broncos. So now I'm wondering, the Warriors sitting there this week going, geez, maybe we should have let him go to the Dolphins because now we have to face him.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, everything, what goes around comes around, doesn't it? And but it's a great story, and whatever happens, it's going to be a great game, I think. And I wouldn't like to. I think the Broncos should win it, but my goodness, they've got to be on top form, I think. And it's going to be Adam Reynolds versus Sean Johnson. So many interesting stories, aren't there, in that game? But Adam Reynolds, can he lead the Broncos to their first grand final for several years? I think 2015 was it. They were last there when they lost to the Cowboys. Absolutely. And Sean Johnson, I think it was 2012, was it, when the Warriors were last there, if I remember rightly. Can he lead them to a grand final? And what a whole load of interesting stories.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I expect a big New Zealand crowd to be there. In other Southern Hemisphere news, in the Queensland Cup, the East Tigers 22 defeated the Burleigh Bears 18. They get through now to the Interstate Cup final, which we played on Grand Final Day. They'll verse the New South Wales Cup winner. Just for this one, a special shout out to Matt Church, the East Tigers head coach. He coached me when I was in university. He's gone from there to the assistant coaching role with the Falcons. Then he was the coach of the PNG Hunters, and now has the East Tigers head coaching role.
So you taught him everything he knows.
Exactly right. I'll take a little bit of credit for that.
But the Tigers are very keen on following the Dolphins into into the NRL, aren't they? And on the west side of Brisbane, I think it is. And I don't know. You're a Queenslander, Jake. Do you think another team based to the west of Brisbane would be a good addition to the NRL? Yeah,
well, I think so. East Tigers are more sort of east side, but I think the Jets are more west side. So
that's the Jets.
The Jets are out Ipswich way, which is a little bit west of Brisbane.
Yeah,
but
you know Brisbane geography better than I do. Yeah.
But look, I think back when the last bid was had, Ipswich Jets and East Tigers had pretty strong bids as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if either of those two were candidates for it. East Tigers have a very proud history at the club. So too do the Jets. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think the East Tigers would put one nearly, very close to the centre of Brisbane. If you went out to Ipswich, it's probably an hour's drive out there. So it's a little bit further out, much like the Dolphins, who are based out at Redcliffe. That's sort of like an hour's drive out of Brisbane. So if they really want to tee up a battle for Brisbane, they'd go with East. But, if they want to sort of keep the crowds a little bit separate, they should go to Ipswich. But there's so many good options. We've obviously had the success in New Zealand. There's been Perth touted. So
you've got to be slightly jealous of the NRL for the potential options for expansion, haven't you? There are so many places. Perth obviously is a place that's constantly being mentioned, and so on. And as you say, a second New Zealand team, which looks surely on the cards in the next few years. It's they're absolutely spoilt for choice, I think.
Absolutely, especially with how many teams are in Sydney. You could make the case that Brisbane needs a few more. But yeah, I just hope wherever they decide to go next, they give that club more than a year's time to prepare and put together a squad.
Yes. Well, they ought to be looking at 2027, and they need to make a decision by 2025, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, Martin, last week we were talking about a bit of constructive criticism I got around my attire. I was suggested that I go out and purchase a suit. Now, I do have a little bit of a surprise for the viewers. I haven't bought a suit, but I've bought the next best thing. So let me just take off my sweater.
Oh, my goodness.
The Brisbane Broncos jersey. ahead of their crucial matchup this weekend against the Warriors. So.
Yeah, you're definitely not neutral, are you?
Absolutely not. So when you grow up in Queensland, you can't help but hide or try and hide your bias, but I think you should embrace it.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe we'll see you in a Wakefield.
You're a true Queenslander.
Yeah. Hope to see you in a Wakefield Trinity jersey next week.
You never know. Yeah, you never know.
But yeah, we'll move on to some of the news of the week. So obviously we had Wakefield Trinity officially relegated. There's been a few questions about Mark Applegarth. Is he the right man to lead them into their hopeful revival next year?
The answer to that is that I don't know, really. I think Mark is a great kid. He's got a long history with Wakefield, a bit like Matty Peet has with Wigan. Actually, he's coached at academy and other levels at the club, and he's fulfilled various roles. So I'm not absolutely sure that it would be a great idea to replace him at this stage. And they brought him in. They parted company with Willie Poaching at the end of last season and brought Mark on board as the head coach, particularly when obviously they're going to take a massive financial hit from being relegated. I'm not sure that now's the time to put someone else in there. You've got to say that Mark had a squad that was always going to struggle in Super League this year. And, to get the 4 wins that they did after such an appalling start to the season, the second half of the season for Wakefield wasn't actually that bad. And we've actually got, in League Express this week, we've got a reader's poll thing saying which is the worst club on current form in Super League. And we're sort of saying, is it Wakefield or is it Castleford or is it Hull or is it Leeds Rhinos? And, a lot of people might say Wakefield currently are not actually the worst club in Super League, and a few Leeds Rhinos fans might agree with that, the way they've played the last couple of games.
Oh, absolutely. And it is a bit disappointing because Wakefield have had some pretty close score lines over the past few weeks and they've shown some decent form.
Well, they lost 2 games by Golden Point, didn't they? They lost the last game by Golden Point, and earlier in the season they had a trip to Salford and they lost a game there by 13 points to 12 in Golden Point, I seem to remember. So if those 2 games had gone the other way, Wakefield would now have 12 points, and with a points difference of minus 395, they'd be just marginally above Castleford, and we'd be looking ahead to a very exciting last game of the season for both clubs. But, that's sport, isn't it? You win some and you lose some, and you win some very close games and lose some very close games. And unfortunately for Wakefield, that's what happened to them.
Our thoughts are with the club. Hopefully they can turn it around next year in the Championship and hopefully see them back in the Super League very soon. But we've also had some news. Paul Vaughan, the Warrington Wolves front rower, he has been slapped with a Grade E unnecessary contact charge for lifting an injured player, which could yield 4 to 6 weeks. Now, I was at the game. I saw it happen live. It was in the 79th minute with 30 seconds to go. I think it was just Sione Matautia trying to waste a little bit of time, and Paul Vaughan's gone to help him up to try and get to play the ball.
Yeah.
This sort of baffles me. Coming from the Southern Hemisphere, I haven't really seen a charge like this before, but what did you make of it?
Well, if I'm honest about it, I can't really recall seeing it. So whatever it was incidental enough for me not to really notice it, if I'm honest, Jake. And, we've had a few examples now of players being in the dock for lifting up injured players when clearly they were injured and on the ground, lifting up an opponent. And clearly that's not acceptable where there's a clear case of a player lying injured on the floor, because you could potentially do additional damage by doing that. But there is, you have to draw the line somewhere, and clearly when you get to the final minute of a game, players are going to take their time getting up off the ground, aren't they? Particularly when it's a tight game. So without having seen it, I'm hesitant to comment really on what ought to happen to Paul Vaughan, but I'm happy to take your word for it that it wasn't as serious as it sounds in your view.
Well, that's the thing. I was the same. I completely missed it at the game. When the charge was announced, I was like, oh, hang on a minute, and then I saw the replay and it sort of all clicked in my memory, but nothing was made of it at the time of the incident.
No.
Now,
did the TV commentators pick it up?
Not that I'm aware of.
No.
There was no mention of it in the commentary, but Peter Matauti has come out and thrown his support behind Paul Vaughan. He said he tweeted, "This is crazy." So obviously the act was on his brother. So for him to come out and support his teammate against his brother says something. So
yeah, let's hope the brothers are still talking.
That's right. That's right. But as you mentioned, I think there is obviously if the player was concussed or there was a clear injury, there should be none of that. But I think this is one of those common sense incidents where I think Sione Matauti was merely just trying to waste time. So be disappointing to see Paul Vaughan miss 4 to 6 weeks if they can't successfully fight that.
Well, it will certainly put a dampener on their playoff hopes, won't it? Because he's been a really vital part of their side this year, and I think it would be a great shame to do that, to be honest. But, as I say, we have to wait to see what the outcome is. I assume he'll be facing a tribunal hearing tonight, presumably. They're normally on a Tuesday night, and it's Tuesday today. So we'll just have to wait and see what the outcome is of that one, Jake.
That's right. Now, I'm not sure if you heard this news, but the Leeds Rhinos fans have been trapped in Perpignan after...
Yeah, I had it in the paper this week, yes.
How bizarre was this? Do you think this is punishment or a reward to spend an extra day down there, given that performance Leeds put
Well,
up?
they eventually, I think, flew out of Perpignan at 7 o'clock on Monday night, and... I think I said in the paper this week that, some of them would probably want to be delayed even more, with a view to missing this Friday's game against Castleford, because if Leeds play like they have done over the last 2 weeks, then, it would be a horror show, really, wouldn't it? So, having said that, I have a funny feeling that Leeds will improve quite dramatically when they face Castleford on Friday night. Castleford no longer have to win to avoid relegation. So it's going to be a game with nothing riding on it, really. So we'll just have to see how that goes.
I think the Leeds fans probably deserve to be sent off with a win to finish off the season. Obviously, they've got some new recruits coming in next year, which will hopefully bolster the squad a little bit. But, I'm sure they're happy to write this season off.
Well,
next year.
They're going to have to, yeah.
We also had some reports that the Manly Seagulls centre, Morgan Harper, is set to move to Super League. No clubs have been announced yet, but a few weeks ago there were some rumours with potential links between him and Warrington, with Sam Burgess coming in next year. It'd be exciting to see him in Super League next year.
Well, he's a good player, but he is liable to make the odd mistake, is Morgan Harper, that when I've seen him play. So, it's going to be interesting. But they're all interesting guys, aren't they? These guys have come from the NRL. I think what's important, though, for Super League, given that there's a declining pattern of income that Super League clubs are receiving with a lower Sky broadcast deal, and at some point, I mean, I'm a great believer that we play to a salary cap in Super League, and that salary cap is quite difficult for some clubs to spend up to because they don't have the financial resources and they don't have the financial benefactor that some other clubs do have. And I'm wondering now whether we ought to get to the point where we ought to put a cap on overseas players who come to Super League. So if the cap was, say, £2 million in total, should there be a figure of, say, £500,000 that's a cap on players coming from the NRL? Because we need to learn to develop our own talent. If you look at all the teams in Super League, I'd say that probably about 25% of the players these days are Australian and Kiwi and other players from the Southern Hemisphere. And I think that's too much, personally. It's stifling. One of the problems that some clubs have in Super League is that they don't give sufficient opportunities to some of their younger players because their places are being blocked by too many veteran players who have been recruited from the NRL, who tend to be picked because they're on pretty high salaries, and it's a problem. A lot of young English kids are not getting the game time that they ought to get in order to improve to the point at which they can claim those places as of right. So it's an interesting dilemma, I think, but I'm tending towards thinking that way at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously over the weekend we saw the benefits of promoting your junior talent and what Leon Hayes put up for the Warrington Roars.
Absolutely, and that's his first game of the season. And he, he was replacing George Williams, so that wasn't an Australian player he was replacing. But, we need a plan in place for kids like him to get more games to develop at the point at which he can be a regular selection.
I would just say on Leon Hayes, because I was at the game and was able to watch him up front and close in person, but he's 5'5", 19 years old, and just when I saw him run out into the field, I thought, God, he's very small in stature, but geez, he put up a great performance. I think in the first half there, they really Saints sent their attack down his edge and really targeted him, and I think he ended up making like 21 of 24 tackles. Like, he was very solid in defence, especially for his size. And unfortunately for Warrington, they were under the pump the whole first half. The momentum started to swing towards the end of the first half, but in the second half, you could just see that the pressure was sort of off his shoulders, and he just started to play his natural game a little bit more.
I thought his kicking game was pretty good, actually.
Yeah, I think there was one time there where he did a kick for touch, and it almost went 40 or 50 metres. It was a beautiful kick. But yeah, his confidence, you could see it was really starting to grow in that second half, and I tell you what, he has the opportunity there to really stamp his mark on that side, and I think Gary Chambers said he would consider him for selection this week.
Yeah, he did. And so often you find with young players, as they eventually come through, they only manage to come through because of an injury to a player who's, already in the first team. And, then you find that they at last get a chance. And then many of them actually show that they've got what it takes. I mean, Lewis Dodds is a really great example at St Helens at halfback, because he got his chance when Theo Farge, who was playing with St Helens at the time, he was a first choice halfback, but he got injured, quite a serious injury, kept him out for quite a long time. And Lewis Dodd got his chance and took it, and it was great to see a very, very good, confident young player. Brad O'Neill at Wigan has been great this year, in my view, at hooker, and he got his chance when Sam Powell was injured, the first choice Wigan hooker. So it's often the case. Now, you've got to say there must be other Lewis Dodds and Sam Powells at other clubs who don't get a chance because players don't get injured who are effectively blocking their way, and that's obviously, you wonder how much talent isn't coming through. And then what you tend to find is that those players will then be loaned to clubs in the Championship, and some of them lose a bit of heart, really. Lose a bit of direction, and we don't see them making the progress that we'd like to see them make, and that's incredibly disappointing, I think.
It'd be great to watch Leon Hayes' development over the next few years. I think he's got the potential to be like an Adam Reynolds type
I think
player,
so, yeah.
Who's obviously quite short himself and has a great kicking game. The reason for Broncos' success this year. So, but keeping on that sort of topic in terms of Australian players coming over, Adam Clune, there's been reports in Australia that he has signed with the Huddersfield Giants. Hasn't been confirmed yet, but what do you make of this?
Well, he's a very intelligent guy, is Adam Clune, isn't he? He's noted for being quite a smart young man. Even setting apart his rugby ability, and I've been quite impressed when I've seen him play. He was with St George for quite a long time, wasn't he? And I think he could add quite a lot to Huddersfield next season. And if he is coming there, we'll see. But hopefully that will be the case.
Absolutely. So we've got a pretty exciting championship relegation battle heating up at the moment. Martin, what can you tell us about this?
Well, it's a thrilling battle in the championship for both playoff places and relegation. And there's a week to go, Jake, And with only a week to go, there's only one club in the Championship that has no chance of getting into the playoffs and no chance of being relegated, and that is Widnes Vikings. Apart from them, every other club that's in there can either go, get in the playoffs or still be relegated. There was a great game last night, incidentally, when York beat Batley 15-14 at their home ground, and with a very, very late field goal. It was a great game. There's so many great games in the Championship that you maybe would quite enjoy as well. I mean, obviously you've not seen much Championship rugby yourself, but and they scored a potential try of the week, or even a potential try of the year with Joe Brown. It's one you ought to search for on YouTube if you've not seen it so far. But the relegation battle, you've got Swinton, Keighley, Whitehaven, and Barrow, all of whom could still be relegated. And you've got in the playoffs, you've got 4 teams that are assured of being in the playoffs now: Featherstone, Toulouse, Sheffield, and Bradford. But you've still got London, Halifax, York, and Batley that could get the final 2 places. So it's a real great competition as a Championship, and it's a real, for me, an incredible disappointment that Viaplay, or as they used to be known as Premier Sports, will be pulling out of rugby league and all domestic sport in this country next year and won't be continuing to televise the Championship. I really do hope that another broadcaster can pick up on the Championship and start showing some of its games, because it really is. It's a great competition, and it needs to be shown on a broadcasting outlet, I think, and it ought to. The Rugby Football League ought to be capable of promoting it perhaps a bit more than they do.
And that game last night was streamed on the Our League app, I believe.
I'm not sure. I don't know about that, but yeah, maybe it was.
I mean, that's an opportunity there. If if we're looking to have these games broadcasted, I mean, they've done a few on that app this year, so it'd be nice.
They have, but we need to see more people tuning in to sort of see what a great competition this is, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely right. If you had to, put your money on who's going to be promoted, obviously the Rovers are still going very strong.
Well, Featherstone beat Toulouse at the weekend, didn't they? In Toulouse, and it looks like those two teams will play in the promotion in the Championship Grand Final, probably at Featherstone. But you've got to say Featherstone do look like the team that's going to replace Wakefield. They're near local rivals in Super League next year, and I think Featherstone are already making plans to be able to compete in the Super League next year. But can they be confident of getting there? Well, Toulouse clearly was second best at the weekend, but they won't be an easy team to beat, particularly with some of the talent that they've got available.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, I believe there was a piece in this week's paper about Moses Mbai settling into life over here in England, and geez, he's been a pretty good signing for St Helens this year. Obviously,
yes, he replaced Joey Lussick, didn't he? And it seems like a really great guy, and has fitted in very well to St Helens. St Helens are an interesting club because they always do their research into players before they sign them. And I think Moses Mbai's had a long history in the NRL, and I think everybody knows, what a great guy he is. And he was actually talking about bringing, his family are coming over to join him, I think, this week. So that'll be great for him. And, it wouldn't be at all surprising if he were a key player on their march to the grand final.
Yeah, absolutely. I was sort of sitting there wondering, obviously the Saints have signed Darryl Clark for next year. I wonder if Moses remains at the club in that off the bench role.
I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I don't know what I can't remember just offhand the details of his contract with St Helens, but I'd be very surprised if he only came for the rest of this season, if they didn't retain him next year. But Darryl Clark's a really interesting signing, isn't he? To replace James Roby. There was a very interesting piece that John Wells did on Sky last Friday night before the Warrington Saints game, where he looked back at the Warrington recent defeat by Salford, and pointed out one or two of Darryl Clarke's deficiencies defending near his own line in quite a revealing sort of way. I think John Wells is a really smart analyst, and if Darryl is going to successfully replace James Roby next year at Saints, then I'm sure that they will be looking very hard at that aspect of his game. I mean, everybody knows Darryl Clarke's a great guy from dummy half. Is a tremendous threat, particularly as a running dummy half player, but his defence near to his own line, is very important as well. And, I have a funny feeling Saints will be looking at that quite closely.
Well, they've got a full off-season to sort of work on it, so
absolutely,
fingers crossed it all works. And, it's also... It's a little bit sad almost seeing the last few games of James Roby's career. He's been such a great player for so many years now, and will go down as one of the all-time greats in both hemispheres.
There are lots of players, of course, who obviously will be playing the final game very soon. Some of them this Friday, and it's always sad to see them go. Obviously, Louis McCarthy-Scarsbrook, who also plays for Saints, he's in his final season there too, and he's been a real great guy, incredibly lively character on and off the field, and it'll seem strange without Roby and McCarthy-Scarsbrook at St Helens next year. So we've also got Chris McQueen, a fellow Queenslander, I think, isn't he?
Yep.
Playing his final game for Huddersfield this Friday. And we've mentioned already Sean Kenny-Dowell, who will quit at Hull KR at the end of this season, and quite a few others. Nathan Massey leaving Castleford, which I don't know whether he's going to play on elsewhere. The indications are that he might do, but again, he's been an incredible servant to the Castleford club, and deserves all the praise in the world for what he's contributed to that club over the years. So it's an interesting time, and always sad to see players retiring, particularly when you can remember them as young kids just coming through. I mean, James Roby. Another really interesting example, actually, because when I think he played his first game in 2004, if I remember right, or was it 2006? I struggle to remember just offhand. But, he was very much behind a real great player called Kieran Cunningham when he first started playing for Saints. And he was a kid who, we were talking earlier about young players being held back by players in the first team. But the thing with him was he came on the scene as a teenager, but right from the start, he was on the bench every week with Kieran Cunningham starting at hooker, and he was able to get that experience, which has stood him in such good stead throughout his career. So, but what a career it's been, And I still think the highlight of his career was leading St Helens to that victory in Penrith earlier this year in the World Club Challenge. That was an incredible achievement, and he showed in that game what an incredible captain he is, I think.
Absolutely right. And, I just sort of watched him on the weekend and think, God, he could still perform at the top level. I think he
could
one
play
of the
another
best
year,
hookers.
potentially. Yeah, he could play another year.
Yeah. Well, it's, unfortunately, you got to call time, and what better way to do it while you're still healthy? I'm sure he's got a few niggling sort of injuries, but...
yes, I don't know what his future will be. I mean, whether he'll stay with St Helens on the coaching staff, who knows? I would have thought he might do, but I don't think there's anything yet been announced about that. But I dare say something will come out in future. But if any player ever deserved to be recognised in the honour system, I think it's James Roby. So... Sir James Roby, perhaps. Maybe that would be a bit more than we can expect, but certainly he ought to. He's been such a rugby league great in this country that he deserves to be recognised, but in a wider context than purely in the game itself.
I've experienced it a little bit lately. Obviously, players that I sort of admired and idolised growing up have sort of come and gone, and now I'm sort of getting to the age now where, I'm seeing, like the Sean Kenny-Dowes, the Chris McQueens. Chris McQueen played a few Origin games, so yeah, very sad to see their careers come to an end. But what a career they've had!
Oh yeah.
Now moving on, we also had some quite sad news south of in the southern hemisphere. John McDonald has unfortunately passed away in his hometown, or my hometown of Toowoomba. He played 10 interstate games for Queensland, 13 caps for Australia. He guided Maroons to the historic inaugural State of Origin victory, and he was a QRL chairman from 1992 to 2012, and also served time as ARL chairman. Quite a loss for the rugby league community in the Southern Hemisphere. Oh, absolutely, yeah. I actually did meet John McDonald some years ago, and a really great guy, and I think one of his probably his greatest achievement. I mean, it's when somebody's achieved a lot in life, it's difficult to say what the greatest achievement is, but probably his greatest achievement was coaching that very first Queensland State of Origin team in 1980, when they famously beat New South Wales and set up State of Origin to become what it's become since then, and that was amazing. And you can still look back at that game and see what an incredibly atmospheric game it was. Artie Beetson, of course, at the end of his career back in 1980, leading Queensland to that amazing win. So yes, and my condolences to John McDonald's family. I'm sure they're very sad at having lost such a great guy. Absolutely right. Yeah, very sad to see. But yeah, what a lasting impact he's had on what Origin has become today, and yeah, such a big loss.
Another guy who died very sadly was Lionel Morgan. Were you going to mention him?
No, I hadn't.
Lionel Morgan. Well, he was again a really fascinating man, symbolically very important, because he was the first Indigenous player to play for Australia back in 1960, when he was selected for the Kangaroos against France. And it's incredible to think, isn't it, that when you look at how many Indigenous players there are in the game today, that he was the first to ever get that honour, and made his own piece of history, and that was before Indigenous people were allowed to vote in Australia. And there were lots who followed him. Arthur Beetson, of course, Jonathan Thurston, Steve Renouf. There've been some wonderful Indigenous players in rugby league in Australia. But he was the first. He was the very first to, not the first to play, of course, but the first to be selected for Australia, and that was. He was the first Indigenous player to be selected for any Australian sporting representative national team. Whatever sport you're looking at, rugby league was the trailblazer in that sense. And it's a thing I think we all ought to be very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Giving opportunities to young Indigenous men, and he lived to the ripe old age of 85. Which was, as they say, a pretty good lifespan. But yeah, again, condolences to his family and everybody who will miss him, because as I say, they can feel so proud of what he achieved.
Absolutely, and we can't sort of go back in time to sort of see all the things that he had to overcome to get to that position. I can only imagine some of the backlash and criticism that he had to go through in his career. So, yeah, he certainly paved the way. And, if it wasn't for someone like him, we wouldn't have the greats like Artie Beetson and John
No, but the great thing about rugby league is that no matter what your background, in rugby league, if you're good enough, then you'll tend to get picked, won't you? And that's obviously what happened in his case. And, we can feel very proud of that, because for many years the other major sports in Australia never picked Indigenous players, and the Australian cricket team has only recently picked its first Indigenous player. It's a thing that we don't make much of in rugby league, how inclusive we are. But, maybe it's something we ought to be a little bit more positive about, to be honest, Jake.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, before we get into looking at this weekend's games, Martin, is there anything I've missed or any news you'd like to touch on? Anything that I've forgotten?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we had a press conference last week, didn't we, for previewing the England Tonga series, and I've written a piece. I mean, it's quite incredible that we play our grand final on the 14th, and the Test series begins on 8 days later, on the 22nd, when England play Tonga at St Helens. That's giving us very little time to prepare, because I think the logic is that quite a lot of the England players will be playing in that grand final. So they'll have virtually no time to celebrate, no time to prepare to face the Tongans, and it's making Sean Wayne's job incredibly hard. On the other hand, the NRL Grand Final is on the 1st of October. I don't know how many Tongans will be involved in that Grand Final, but probably fewer than English players involved in our Grand Final. So basically, Christian Wolfe, the Tongan coach, has a much greater preparation time than Sean Wayne has for England. And, we are handicapping ourselves, and it's because, our clubs insist on playing 27 matches during a season. And so Sean Wayne is having to battle our clubs as much as he's having to battle Tonga almost. And I think that's just a ridiculous situation.
And you touched on it in your column that, assuming that Wigan and St Helens make the grand final, that's a large portion of the selection.
Well, I would imagine there'd be at least 10 players who would perhaps be in Sean's England squad, who would be playing in that game if those two teams make it, which is... it's really going to be difficult.
Absolutely right. And I think Christian Wolfe mentioned that they would have a little get-together before they flew over. So, and I'm just trying to think off the top of my head, like, with the 4 teams that remain in the NRL, I can't think of too many that will play for Tonga.
No.
So they've got the benefits of rest. I know Christian mentioned it'll be up to the players to keep themselves fit in terms of match fitness, so that might go against him, but I think if Sean Wayne had the option of having a few weeks rest as well, he would take that.
I'm sure.
Can't wait for that to kick off. That'll be an exciting series, and hopefully we see 3 really tough fought battles.
Absolutely, yeah.
I guess we'll look at this week's Super League matchups. Obviously there's a few there that have caught our eye. Is there any in particular you wish you could
Well, Lee versus Wigan looks a really good one, doesn't it? Because that will determine whether Wigan win the League Leaders' Shield and finish first, or whether Lee can consolidate their 4th place in Super League, because they've got to keep one eye. Hold on, my phone is going. Let me just. So they've got to try and consolidate their position, and Ulkea are coming up on the rails with a trip to Wakefield. So, that's those 2 matches will be really crucial. And then, of course, we've got Warrington's trip to Huddersfield. If they can win that game, they will get the 6th place in the playoffs. But Salford against the Catalans, that's going to be interesting as well, because if Wigan slip up at Lee, then Catalans, if they win that game, they will probably win the League Leaders' Shield themselves. So there's a lot to look forward to. The only games where there's nothing at stake are, it strikes me, Leeds Rhinos versus Castleford Tigers. That's the only game where nothing really counts. So
we won't expect to see any players being rested by any of the clubs. You can't imagine.
Oh, hard to know. We've not seen their squad lists yet, but I would imagine that may well be the case. Certainly, you would imagine. It'd be interesting to see whether young Leon Hayes gets a run again for Warrington at Huddersfield. Whether they might rest George Williams again, with a view to coming back for the playoffs if they get there. But they might think that they need to play Williams to get the win at Huddersfield. So it's an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into the NRL prelims, one other thing I thought of is the Prime Minister's 13 matchup between PNG and Australia coming up. Nene McDonald was named for the PNG side. He still hasn't returned back to the league.
It doesn't look as though he's coming back, does it, really?
No.
And certainly now that they're no longer in the running for the playoffs, it's a bit inconsequential. But of course, his contract does go into next year, so that's going to be interesting to see how that's resolved. Maybe he doesn't want to come back. Who knows?
Yeah, it's. I don't know what's going on there, but it seems a little bit unprofessional from where I'm sitting.
It does.
And if you're a Leeds teammate, do you really want to be playing with someone like that you can't rely on heading into next season?
Well, that's for them to say, isn't it? But yeah, it's a tricky one.
That's right. And obviously, we don't know the full story. There could be some circumstances going on behind the scenes.
You never know.
Of, so
yeah. Don't want to be too critical because he's just had a baby and you never quite know what the situation with that is, do you? So if there were any complications with the birth, and I'm not saying there was, but if there were, then it would be perfectly understandable for him to want to stay over there.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess looking at this weekend's prelims, Penrith Storm, Broncos Warriors, who are you picking in these two?
Got to be Penrith beating Melbourne, I think. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think Broncos, I mean, it's looked for a long time like Penrith-Brisbane grand final. And I can't see any reason to change my opinion.
Yep, no, I agree with you on that one. Hopefully my Broncos can get a win, and I haven't jinxed them by wearing the jersey in this podcast. So fingers crossed I can come in and be cheering next week. All right, well, I am happy with that if you are, Martin. Nothing else you'd like to mention?
No, just one final thing, I suppose. The championship, every championship game... or nearly all the championship games have something riding on them this weekend, apart from Featherstone versus Widnes, oddly enough, because Featherstone are guaranteed to finish first and Widnes are guaranteed to remain in the championship next season. Okay. Apart from that, all the other games have a top six element to them or a relegation element to them. So a lot of exciting games coming up.
Oh, perfect. Might be an opportunity for those two maybe to rest players, obviously.
Absolutely, yeah.
Featherstone's best interest. But anyway, we'll wrap it up here. Don't forget, if you'd like to grab yourself a League Express subscription, head along to www.totalrl.com/shop. I'll repeat that, www.totalrl.com/shop to secure your subscription. Grab a copy of Richard's book.
50 Wigan Legends in their own words. Great book.
Rugby League World magazine, you can also access a subscription to that on there as well, which is published monthly. And don't forget, if you're watching on YouTube, to subscribe to our channel, Total Rugby League. And you can also listen to us on Google, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So, and while you're at it, also go give... the League Express Facebook page a like, the Twitter, go and follow our TikTok page, League Express, Instagram, League Express Official. We're on everything now. So
we are. Great stuff, Jay.
It's hard to manage, isn't it?
It's quite amazing.
A lot of moving pieces.
Yeah, there are.
All right, well, we'll wrap it up here. Thanks again, Martin. I'll see you again next week.
Pleasure.
Cheers.
Thanks, Jack. Bye.
No